1864 there is the Sugar Act. Who was the prime minister that orchestrated that? Does anybody besides Roscoe and myself? Go ahead, Joy. George Grenville is the architect of the Sugar Act. He is also the architect of the Quartering Act and the Currency Act, right? The Sugar Act is the first attempt to sort of generate revenue through taxation. The Stamp Act is another attempt to generate revenue through taxation. The Townshend Acts are a third attempt to generate revenue through taxation, right? Now, we know that the colonial Americans resisted this legislation with various levels of intensity. The Sugar Act, not too much. The Stamp Act, vigorously. The Townshend Acts, eventually and gradually, opposition sort of expanded. And we also know that they argued these taxes went beyond just an economic inconvenience. That these taxes represented a violation of their natural rights. Just quickly, somebody tell me what this notion of natural rights meant, and then how those taxes represented a violation of those natural rights. Who would like to do that? Go ahead, Danielle. Oh, so you are saying to me, dear Danielle, that there was a belief that all human beings were endowed with certain natural rights. What were those natural rights? Life, liberty, and property. And who was one of the British philosophers that had articulated this idea that was important to Americans? Go ahead, dear Danielle. John Locke. So John Locke had argued that all human beings were endowed with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and property. So what? So Natalie, so what? So people had rights. How did that relate to government, dear Natalie?
They said they weren't being represented.
Well, no, let's just go more fundamentally. Go ahead, Taylor. So you are saying the purpose of government was to protect those rights because people could not naturally protect their rights from one another. So people contracted with government for the purpose of protecting rights, correct?
Correct.
Right? So this was called the contract theory of government. And so if government was unable, unwilling, or injurious to people's rights, then what was it, Natalie, the responsibility of the people to do? And to replace it with one that would protect their rights, right? Now, okay, this is kind of the ideology of rights, and that goes to the Declaration of Independence, which we'll talk about in a moment. But how did taxation fit into this? How did taxation fit, dear Emily that's up at the top up there, how did taxation fit into this whole notion of rights? Dear Emily. Oh, so there was taxation without representation. How was that a violation of natural rights?
Like the colonists felt that they should be able to have a say in,
okay, maybe so, dear Emily. But would this not be true? If you are taxed without representation, then that's theft, correct? And theft is a violation of your right to property. And so the colonists argued that taxation without representation was tyranny, taxation without representation was theft, and therefore a violation of their rights. Correct, Thomas? Sure, that's correct. Now, what did the British say in response to this? I mean, this is a British argument. They had a response. They had a retort. What was it, dear Taylor?
Virtual representation.
Virtual representation. You are represented. Every member of Parliament represents every person in the British Empire, regardless of the fact if they voted for it. The American colonists never bought this, right? They never bought this. The American colonists said, look, taxes without representation is theft, a violation of our natural rights, right? The British said, you are virtually represented. Parliament is supreme. We can tax you if we want to. Oh, what was the legislation that sort of asserted that? We can tax you if we want to. We don't want to right now. Go ahead, Kelly. The Declaratory Act. And that was in the aftermath of the repeal of the Stamp Act, correct?
Correct.
Now, so we went through that entire sort of sequence of events. You know, the Boston Massacre, the Townshend duties. You know, one thing I would like to point out in that, and there are a few questions on that, but not a lot. It kind of skips to the T Act. That throughout this time period, you know, when there's this contention about taxation and contention about the writs of assistance, and other actions that the British is taking, dissolving legislatures and other things, that few people are really talking about independence. You know, I mean, people don't like it. They think it's a violation of their natural rights. They resent it. They resist it. But few people are really actively talking about independence. The sequence of events that kind of leads to the eventual division and the Declaration of Independence begins with the Tea Act. Oh, who will tell us about the Tea Act? Who do you think of? Amalia, will you tell us of the Tea Act?
The British taxed the colonies for like small things like tea and things.
So you're saying the tea tax, the tax on tea, was a part of the Townsend duties, and that the Townsend duties had been repealed except for the small tax on tea, correct? And for 3 years the colonists accepted this tax. Why did they accept this tax on tea even though it was part of the Townsend duty? What were they doing, dear Amalia? What were they doing? They were buying tea from whom? No, they weren't. They were buying it from the Dutch. So they were avoiding the tax. So what did the Tea Act do? The Tea Act that was passed in 1773. Well, yes, from whom? Go ahead, Roscoe.
Didn't it make it so the British tea was less expensive than
Yes.
Dutch tea?
And so under the Tea Act, then Americans had to buy tea directly from what company?
The British East India Company.
Had a direct monopoly over tea sales in America. And the result of the Tea Act would have been that the British East India Company, which had burgeoning warehouses full of tea, would have been able to get rid of their surplus tea by selling it directly to Americans who drank a lot of tea. Right? Americans would have gotten cheaper tea because all the middlemen that were a part of the tea selling sort of process would have been cut out, and the British East India Company would have had a direct sort of relationship with American retailers, and Americans in the process of selling that tea or buying that tea would have accepted the tax that they were avoiding before. Now, this doesn't go very well. Eventually, resistance to the Tea Act ends up with the Boston Tea Party, the dumping of the tea in Boston Harbor. How does Britain react to the Boston Tea Party? How does Britain react to the Boston Tea Party? Go ahead, Nicoletta. They passed the Intolerable Acts. What is the colonial reaction to the Intolerable Acts? To call for, Kelly? Go ahead, Thomas.
Continental Congress.
The First Continental Congress, which is colonial unity, right? If you remember, there was colonial unity in opposition to the stamps, and now there is colonial unity in opposition to the coercive acts. The coercive acts are the Intolerable Acts, were legislation intended to punish Boston for the Boston Tea Party. The First Continental Congress was the colonial response in support of Boston. Now, the First Continental Congress does a lot of things, but one of the things that it doesn't do is assert a desire for independence. The First Continental Congress asserts a desire for Britain to stop what they're doing, to no longer tax them for the purpose of generating revenue, to allow their colonial legislatures to behave in the manner that they had behaved previously. The First Continental Congress, like most of the American colonists up to that point, basically wanted things to go back to the way that they were prior to 1763. Now, the British really escalate the situation in the wake of the Boston Tea Party because property is destroyed, Parliament's patience sort of is exhausted, and so the First Continental Congress is an attempt to sort of to come to some solution that doesn't really work out. What happens after the First Continental Congress adjourns is the events at Concord and Lexington. And remember, at Concord and Lexington, it was a desire by the British governor in Massachusetts to sort of, arrest the troublemakers and stop them from gathering ammunition that results in a military conflict that results in the loss of life. Now, what was the American reaction to Concord and Lexington? Go ahead, Parker. The Second Continental Congress, dear Parker. Right, Concord and Lexington was in April of 75. In May of 75, the Second Continental Congress convenes. And the Second Continental Congress is famous for several things. Anybody know any of them? Second Continental Congress.